Welcome, and thank you so very much for joining me on another episode of Talking Cloud. Now, you've heard me say this before. This is where we talk about cloud computing, anything cloud, all things cloud. And come on, man, in this day and age, it's ubiquitous. It's so pervasive. Everything in computing touches cloud one way or another, it seems. Now, I've told you so many times as well, I'm just the Gilligan in this equation. I always seek out professors, and man, I got a great one today. We've got a super exciting guest, CEO of his own advisory organization. I got to get to the top of the page, so I read it. Executive Advisors Group. Now, Matt, he himself is a tenured Chief Information Security Officer at InfraGard. He co-founded CISO Desk Reference Guide. You go on here. He was a board of directors at ISACA, a member of Athenia, which is a private CISO organization. I mean, he was the CISO at Evotech. For many years, or at least a couple anyway, research director, security and risk management at Gartner. And come on, man, anybody in the biz who doesn't pay the Gartner tax, right? We all do. So I'm super excited. I go on and it's CISO after CISO, also equity partner. You got to go way back to the beginning of the millennia to see he was in a regional sales manager kind of role at AT&T and whatnot. But I'm super excited to have with me today Matt Stamper. Matt, super happy to have you here. Thanks so very much.
I am thrilled to be here. And just like you said, everything ultimately is in the cloud, and thinking about it from a CISO perspective, security in the cloud, thinking about on-premise, kind of the hybrid environments, everything in one shape or form has some sort of cloud backend, some connectivity there. So I think it's uber important to keep these things front and center. Thrilled to be here.
You said a great segue to just launch off into a CISO's perspective of securing the cloud. It's quite a bit different than securing the on-prem, although there's obviously overlap. What do you think are the most compelling gotchas, or the things that most people will kind of miss or overlook or just not put together when they go from this on-premise to into the milkshake in the sky?
Exactly. It's interesting, Grant, because there's a number of dynamics. I used to be the CISO at a multinational data center and managed services company, and we had an AWS practice. We had co-location facilities and managed services within them. In our traditional managed services environment, everything was configured. It was VMware, kind of EMC, NetApp storage, Checkpoint, Palo Alto firewalls, and different kind of pairs to do things. A variety of infrastructure, and it ran at a time scale that frankly would have made a snail look fast. Everything was very slow in terms of provisioning, etc.
Yeah.
In the cloud environment, our timescales are fundamentally radically different. Things happen in milliseconds. They happen at machine or cloud speed. And from a CISO perspective, what that also means in many cases is that our incident response programs are probably woefully ill-equipped to see the telemetry that takes place at machine speed when we're doing things in kind of a manual basis.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's kind of a clash, right? I mean, in
it's
terms
horrible.
of the speed at which problems occur. and the pace at which we traditionally triage and dissect and what we look at,
Yep,
and do we have the tools to look at that real time, near real time data, right? As opposed
exactly.
to some log, right?
Exactly. I mean, the adage is, there are certain log providers and SIMs that are out there that we're all aware of. You can click a couple of buttons, hit a report, go up, grab a cup of coffee, come back, maybe fix lunch, and in another hour or two, you might get a report that's rendered, or some sort of analysis that's rendered. In the cloud, you don't have that luxury. You need real-time ubiquitous telemetry, and threat actors are operating in very automated ways. They're using tools and techniques that, if we're not thinking about what that threat actor is doing, we could have an environment that is largely compromised, even absent our own awareness, for a long
Yep.
period of time. And so
Yep.
I think, the dynamic that CISOs face, for those of us that have had to carry that title and continue to work in there, is we have infrastructure everywhere. We have infrastructure in home offices, kind of like where I am right now. We have infrastructure in smaller offices and in corporate facilities, in data centers, cloud providers, and then equally important with SaaS providers. And the CISO's job, he or she has to see that ubiquitously. They need to be able to look across that portfolio of different asset classes and manage risk, but manage risk in very different ways. The way you manage risk in on-premise is a lot through configuration. Is granted, as I'm sure you're aware, in the cloud environment, you're programming things.
Hmm.
It is largely,
Highly dynamic, right?
service.
I mean,
Exactly,
it's
as
that's why
code.
it's called EC2. I think the E is
Yep,
elastic, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, so when
exactly.
everything is as code, how you manage security in a code environment is very different than how you manage security in a configured environment. And
Hmm.
when a CISO, when he or she's managing teams where they're having to look at these issues across disparate environments, that's a lot of burden. That's a lot of extra activity that needs to occur. And you've got to make sure you've got teams that are able to kind of move, hopefully somewhat fluently, between those two worlds. You may ultimately end up having a team that is specialized in cloud security and cloud detection and response type capabilities that differs very, very much from a traditional incident response team. So that
Yeah.
was one of the things that really hit me like a ton of bricks when we started doing work in the cloud and thinking through the implications of how we secure the environment.
I would imagine too, and tell me if I'm wrong, but which is I think more common than not. I've got AWS, I've got
Mhm.
Azure, I've got Google, maybe I'm using Alibaba or Oracle. I mean, I've certainly have multiple, and each time you introduce a new one, that just exponentially
Yeah.
increases that complexity, right?
They're very different. I mean,
Yeah,
AWS is fundamentally different than Azure, and both of those are fundamentally different than GCP.
yeah,
And they all have their nuance. They all have their little quirks about them. And so the strain that you put on your operations teams, on your security teams, on your development teams, is being able to work across multiple environments and to do that securely, and to be able to minimize risk of misconfiguration, minimize risk of accounts or permissions and
yeah.
entitlements that have been kind of dialed back a little bit. There's a misnomer that a number of organizations are finding, is that service and machine accounts tend to be a lot more overly permissioned than one would anticipate. And so there's a lot of risk there. I mean, that's a challenge with any cloud environment, is having the environment and account takeover in the cloud, especially with elevated privileges or machine account that's a
Yeah.
little bit more promiscuously configured than ideal. So,
Well, I mean, we know uh, it's easier to cut through the vacant lot, right, than to go all the
yeah,
way to the corner, right? I mean, in an analogy, and so to over provision privileges, because then he's going to be able to speak with all of the other peers or devices that uh, need to be communicated with, right?
Yep.
No problem. It's just a machine, and not to mention the identities and provisions that occur without you really even realizing it. You know, the
Exactly.
developer does, right?
And
Most
they
of the
may not.
time.
I mean, there's the way identities are handled in Azure and Microsoft differs dramatically than I am in AWS.
Right.
Your Microsoft 365 environment, just as a named individual, might have
Yeah.
6 or 7 identities associated with it.
Yeah.
Uh, that make the number of accounts, the number of kind of credential reviews, things of that nature that you have to do significantly more challenging. But
Right.
this is the joy of our profession is that every time you turn over a rock, you're going to find something interesting. Just
That's right. That's right.
hopefully it
Well,
doesn't bite you.
it's there are few industries, Matt. I think that the only other one that first comes to mind is not one that I want to point out, but it's the reality, and that's conflict, right?
Mhm.
It's war. When I have an opponent that I'm trying to best in their efforts against me, that's
Mhm.
what we have happening, all around the world. And in a very basic sense, you start hitting me with a club, I get a shield, and
Yep.
I pick up a club or a mace or something else, right? And there we go. And there's not a lot of industry that no end in sight
Mhm.
as long as you have an opponent, which I think fair to say
We do.
we will.
I'm heavily involved with the FBI InfraGard program. I function as a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, cross-sector council chair within InfraGard. And what that means is we've got a group of approximately 800 plus CISOs across the country from different critical infrastructure, healthcare, transportation,
Hmm.
energy, all the various critical infrastructure sectors that are out there. Our focus is making sure that we're aware of what's going on kind of outside of our proverbial four walls and sharing information very quickly. If we see something that is high risk, if there are issues that require kind of immediate attention, not necessarily in the context like a real time threat intelligence platform, but being able
Right.
to communicate best practices and, hey, I'm seeing this, or you guys also seeing that.
Right. A
It's
community to bounce the stuff off of, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
And we've
absolutely.
got nation state adversaries, Grant, that are very well tooled. I mean, the Russians, the Chinese, North Korea, Iran, Syria, et
To name a
al.
few.
Yeah, they
uh,
they have very sophisticated teams. They're well tooled. They
yeah,
bring the weight of their governments behind them.
yeah,
And they are actively trying to get into our critical infrastructure. I mean,
yeah.
we see this with Salt Typhoon, with our telecommunications providers. We saw this in some of the earlier issues with ransomware. Anecdotally, here in San Diego, where I live, there's a large hospital chain, and a couple years back, they got hit by ransomware. A neighbor of mine had to go to the emergency room, and they couldn't get access to his medical record because of the
Mm,
ransomware.
mm,
So this
mm.
is
It's
that
serious.
ongoing kind of paranoia. I
Yeah,
like to tell people and friends, what do you do? Well, I'm paid to be paranoid. I'm paid
yeah,
to figure out how something
totally,
breaks.
totally. And it's it's kind of goes against who I am as an individual, quite frankly, if I think
Mhm.
it through, because I don't think, how could I break in or how could I exploit or, you know what I mean? I do out of the safety because I'm aware of the environment being in this industry and having been in it as long as, we both have. Um, but it's a real special skill, I think, to have that perspective, to be able to
Mhm.
look and eyeball and kind of really see the whole picture. And I think that that's becoming, that was a big acquisition for Checkpoint, right? We got this company, Cyberint, and it's all about being able to get every piece of telemetry and data on you that a hacker could have
Yeah.
and get without any agents installed, without stealing any credentials,
Hmm.
purely what, and it's pretty remarkable now because we're so hyper connected 24/7, 365 with the supercomputer that is yes, connect automatically no matter what.
Yep.
I mean, that's what results in this enormous amount of information that's just out there if you know how to grab it.
Knowledge. I have a good friend of mine that works in one of the local law enforcement agencies here in San Diego, and he's been doxxed, and it's obviously a concern. My whole family is law enforcement.
Sure.
And there was a book by Michael Bazell. I probably am butchering his last name, and it's called Extreme Privacy. It's 500 pages long. So
Mm.
you start thinking about what does it take to remove a lot of our digital detritus, that footprint that we leave with everything that we do. It's inordinately complicated. And as a society, we've kind of abdicated the notion of privacy.
Yep.
Social media sites, like you say, our devices are tracking our location, assuming you've
Nobody reads the mouse print, Matt. Come on. I mean,
exactly.
you and we're in an era where it's all about I want it right now.
Yeah,
Hey, did you hear about that app?
yeah.
No.
I got to
Yeah,
download.
download it. Downloads a 300 megabyte app in a no time,
Yep.
open. Yeah. And you're off.
And
And
there's the contacts, the photos, your files, everything in there.
yeah,
Actually, you
and
probably
you just next, okay, or you don't even get that kind of interrogation because it's all in the mouse print by clicking okay, you accept, right?
yep.
There's a lot of that in the EULAs that are out there.
It's
Um,
scary.
it is, but it is, I think, exacerbated and made even more harmful in the because of the speed,
Yeah.
right? The acceleration. I was telling that to my youngest son. He'll be 24 next month, and what I believe this is in so many ways is an accelerator.
Hmm.
And I'm talking about from a social impact and use. Um, it's also an inhibitor, right? So it accelerates your access to things as a young boy that you'd never get to,
Hmm.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, if you think back when you and I were, in our teen years, I mean, it was Sears catalogs, right? I mean, at
Uh-huh.
best, there
Or
was,
Benny
there was,
Hill. Watching.
yeah, I mean, exactly, Hee Haw,
Yeah.
another one. Um, but now, I don't need to even go into it, but that accelerated access just is game changer um, in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Not always healthy, and it's one of the things that's like the genie's out of the bottle. So now we have to wrestle with trying to deal with the genie out of the bottle, right? Because I mean, you're seeing schools, right, that are saying no phones during the school day.
Hmm.
Have you seen that? There's like I
Yeah,
saw
like
this
LA
little.
County has done that. A number of school districts are starting to do that, and I love
There's a
that. I think that's
pouch.
a great idea.
I've seen this like it's a little pouch, right,
Hmm.
that the phone goes into, and that's because of the anxiety by not having their phone.
Hmm.
So this way, the kids still have their phone, but they can't use it, which I find very interesting as opposed to just piling it into a drawer somewhere.
Yep.
But um, it doesn't seem like, that's kids, but I mean, in business, we're not slowing down on the acceleration of our digitization, right? I mean, it's moving even faster. Um, so, back, I guess, to when you think of it in terms of, a CISO, you were talking about you worked with the FBI and InfraGard. We know nation states are out there. How much do you think they're really Are they after the 3, 4, 5 store boutique, or are they really going after, the big elephants?
I think, interestingly enough, Grant, there's a bifurcation in the nation state strategies and their tactics. I think, and this is going to be a bit of a gross exaggeration, so kind of accept it
Sure.
as I frame it here. If you look at Russia and North Korea, those are primarily financially motivated. The Korean regime basically gets a fairly decent subsidy from all the ransomware payments that it's receiving. Same thing with a lot of the criminal gangs out of Russia. It's very financially motivated.
Yep.
If you look at it and juxtapose it with respect to China and in the Chinese Communist Party, the Thousand Talents programs, things of that nature, those are very clearly focused in on intellectual property, things that can be used ultimately for China as a nation's benefit. Uh,
Right.
you see
Military secrets and whatnot.
exactly,
Yep.
and in the level of organizations that get hit. You'll hear a smaller company. They might be involved with the defense industrial base or the defense supply chain, but they're really, really way downstream. A
Right.
contractor, a sub of a contractor, just way, way, way down. They may, depending on what they do, might be in the proverbial crosshairs of that nation state, depending on what's there. And
Sure.
so, my advice, we have definitely a cyber poverty line out there. My advice is, even if you're a small company, there are individuals, there are organizations and
Service
within
providers,
the space
absolutely.
that want what you have, and they
Yeah.
will find a way
Oh,
to
I'm sorry. I was thinking
go
something
after it.
else, Matt.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
there are, and you're right. There's nefarious and bad people everywhere, right?
exactly.
That are going after the big elephants and
And the
grandmas
mice that
and
are walking
easy
underneath
praise.
the elephant's feet.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. It's um I find it fascinating how pervasive it is. Hey,
Hmm.
I know what I was going to ask you. You mentioned a few different regions. Do you see any different complexion from a motivation perspective out of Middle East, Iran, Syria? Is it militarily based? It's monetary. Where do you see those guys fall?
There's certainly some ideological issues associated with Iran.
Yeah,
That would
that's what I was thinking is that they more than any, although I've heard Russia likes to disrupt with disinformation in terms of our social
Russia meddles
activities.
in every damn thing they can.
Yeah,
If you think about it from a demographic perspective, it's kind of a dying country. Lifespans are decreasing. The population is not growing. It's got demographic problems that are absolutely horrific. But boy, do they find a way to meddle in everything. And
yeah,
I'm pretty pretty vocal on my disdain of Russia and Putin. Putin's a war criminal in my book.
yeah, yeah.
Russia's a terrorist state. What they've done in Ukraine is horrendous.
It
Uh,
is.
we should be united, supporting Ukraine and kind of pushing a good solid front against Russian aggression.
Yeah,
Russia does not respect treaties. They will not, if there's a ceasefire, likely respect that either. So
yeah,
the
yeah.
notion that Russia somehow has changed its heart under its current leadership, I think, is somewhat laughable. So
Right,
and
right.
I grew up in the era when Reagan and the Cold War and tearing down the wall and everything. So I know it's
Oh
a
yeah,
generational issue.
yeah. I
Uh,
remember Matt as a kid in grade school, seeing movies about the USSR
yep.
and bread lines
Hmm.
everywhere, right? Poverty everywhere. It was always just strife and horrible
Yep.
until, you got to see the truth. And I realized it was, our propaganda, right? And when I got older, I mean, we're doing it to ourselves,
Yeah.
depicting our enemy as just this starving, war torn place. And Well, there obviously are issues there. I mean, I've been. Um, it's not quite as as they depicted in some of those
Yeah.
original movies. You know what I mean?
But, there's significant population concentration in St. Petersburg and Moscow.
Yeah.
It's a tremendously vast country, and so you've got areas where there's a lot of wealth accumulated.
Right.
Granted, a lot of it is oligarchic wealth
Right.
that's been there, and then you have areas that are relatively poor or extremely poor
Right.
vis-a-vis kind of Western standards. But again, I think I look at it is a lot of the ransomware, a lot of the damage that's been done is coming out of Russia, and we have to, as CISOs and security leaders, we need to make sure that our organizations are as secure as possible. In
Yep.
many cases, it's very difficult if you're up against a nation state threat actor versus organized crime and the like. That's a lot more challenging bar, and that's one of the reasons why collaboration with organizations like the InfraGard program, some of the CISO roundtables that I belong to and participate with, we have to be able to say, hey, I'm starting to see this. How are you addressing it? Or I'm kind of worried about maybe the provenance of my code, or if it's open source, who are the people that are contributing to that open source software? Do we know their
Hmm.
backgrounds? Do we know, affiliations, things of that nature? The CISO, for better or worse, you have to be paranoid about pretty much everything that's in your
Right.
operating environment.
Yeah, and there's scale too for the CISO. It seems, and what I mean is, uh, one CISO might have a staff and
Mhm.
a team and lieutenants that are specialists in the areas that he needs. Uh, so he or she doesn't necessarily have to be the expert in those disciplines, but just understand the overall mission, the
Mhm.
objective, and how to keep everything on track. I think. What do you think if you were to identify maybe the one, two, three, the big rocks that CISOs you find overlook
Mhm.
or back burner and shouldn't? Is there anything that kind of comes to mind that you think about?
It's a laundry list. So Grant, one of the things, it's actually the topic of a fifth book that I'm working on, which is on vendor and supply chain risk management. So those dependencies outside of the organization, whether it's a small library of code to a service provider, et cetera, there's just
Yep.
so much risk there. And that's a really difficult place to shine light on. As a CISO, for example, I might review an organization's SOC 2 Type 2 audit. I can't put assurance on that. I can't sit there, if you're my CEO or you're the board of directors, and say this mission critical provider, I read their audit report, it was clean. They almost all are. We're fine. And then a month later, they get hacked and our business is really impacted. That vendor and supply chain risk is an area. There's three or
How
four other.
much? I'm sorry. I'm just
Mhm.
curious. Years ago, when I remember some of the early audits were occurring in the world. If you're accepting credit cards, for
Yeah.
example, right? And it was almost laughable the knowledge, awareness, skills of the auditor
Hmm.
in terms of really the environment, the network environment, security overall. They just seem very focused on checking the boxes.
Yep.
And is it still that pervasive? Is it still like that?
It's getting better, and I'm going to relate it back to actually the great presentation you gave at that recent cybersecurity summit.
Oh,
You're
thank you.
absolutely right. There was a cadre of auditors that would go out and they would ask questions, but they wouldn't understand the context of the question that they were asking or the asset or the infrastructure.
Hmm.
As a case in point, when I was the CISO at that data center company, we had 4 years running where we had excellent audits, unqualified opinions, no exceptions. And you could tell in very short order the depth of that individual auditor's technical
Yep.
knowledge.
Right.
And we would almost invariably, we would start the audit engagement. We would take them out to the backyard where we had our generators. We had two 2 megawatt massive Caterpillar generators, and we'd flip them on, and the noise was deafening. You'd have your
Your
headphones,
earmuffs.
and they'd come in and like, wow, and then everything else from there was perfunctory in a way.
That's so funny.
I'll bring it forward. So there's also who does the audit is important. When you see an audit firm doing, even if it's like an ISO certification or a PCI type audit
Right.
or the SOC 2 type 2 type audits, if it's not a firm that you readily recognize, you might want to take pause. You have to kind of think about it. Are the individuals that are doing that, are they like, I'm a certified information systems auditor from ISACA, do the individuals have their certifications? Now the problem is that our technology is moving so quickly that I might need auditors that are versed in cloud and in looking at things from like a trusted advisor perspective in
Yep.
AWS, or using tools that from like AI tools that would complement things like going through and scanning configurations for known bad configurations,
Right.
kind
Right.
of akin to like a CIS benchmark or a DISA-STIG or something along those lines.
Right.
I think the use of AI, kind of like as you were describing in your discussion,
Yep.
where it can help us find things that are kind of difficult for a human to see, but still actually present risk. That gives me a little bit of hope, that the fidelity of the audit is better. But I'm
Yeah.
going to throw one other wrench in the toolworks. A lot of our audits are a point in time, as of 12/31,
Snapshot.
we see it.
Yep.
We need continuous visibility, continuous telemetry, real-time
Yep.
visibility and telemetry. If you're a CISO and you're relying on whatever that service is or technology, I can't rely on an audit report that maybe is 6 months old. And even if it was current, I still can't rely on it because I don't know the quality of the auditors, even though they're following an AICPA,
Right.
trust services criteria. They're doing those things as they should be. Just the mechanism, the way they do those audits is probably insufficient for the level of assurance. It's
Yeah.
the reason why, going back to your point, Graham, third-party risk, supply chain risk, all of that stuff, I think is going to remain. It's front and center with CISOs,
Yep.
but it's also really challenging. And there's three other areas that I think are also up there: credential management and entitlements. That, to quote Aristotle, it just sucks. It is a really difficult thing to do well. So everything from the authentication and using like FIDO2 or phishing resistant or strong authentication mechanisms,
Yep.
to what does that individual have access to? What does that machine identity or service account have access to? All of that, the permutations of that are
Yep.
just horrific.
Yep.
Patching and configuration management, that's
Always.
challenging.
Always. Yeah.
And then the last one, data governance, data labeling, data expiry. I always talk to some of the companies I work with, or when I give talks in industry, I'll say, you and I have a business, Grant. We've got 1 million consumer records in our operating environment. But out of those million, there's only 100,000 that are current customers. The other 900,000 we haven't had any business with in years and
Yeah.
years and years.
Yep.
We tend to retain those records when, frankly, that's an unfunded liability, because when
Big
we are
time.
breached, now we're doing notifications to 1 million, those
To
900.
people we haven't talked to in
Yeah.
years.
And so we don't
Potentially.
classify
Yeah.
data well. We don't do expiry very well.
Yeah.
We don't do a lot of good access control on data. That's a really challenging one. We see
Yeah.
this in like DFARS with controlled unclassified information, CUI,
Right.
federal contract information, FCI, where you see companies trying to do an enclave. I'm going to carve out a little piece here and implement my NIST 800-171 controls in that environment and really lock it down. The reality is that you've got controlled unclassified information and federal contract information running wild in other parts of the business in many
Yep.
cases. these are four foundational issues. Third party supply chain, your credentials, your vulnerability management, and data that I just don't see getting better significantly in the
Yeah.
short. We may see with some, good AI tools and the like, but these are really tough challenges. These are
Yeah.
really difficult to solve in our profession.
You talk about ACLs, access controls, the
Mhm.
permutation of identities, and the dynamic nature of that. And when you throw in uh, where we're going from a network perspective to this full mesh world,
Yeah.
right? And I don't mean a SASE cloud only, but I mean full mesh, earth to cloud and everything in between, right? Um, Point to point, that world is coming fast,
Yep.
and that is only going to exacerbate the challenges you're talking about, especially from that supply chain perspective.
Hmm.
I think it again, it's just like that plate of spaghetti.
Hmm.
That's my network. Everything's connected to everything.
Yeah.
It's much more challenging, and it doesn't seem like, Matt, we want to land the plane,
No.
right? We want to fix it while we're flying it. So this
Exactly.
whole move to least privilege, zero trust, architecturally interrogating on everything goes completely against the grain of what we've done historically. Oh, who do you work for, Matt? Oh,
Mhm.
you're on Jim's team. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll put you in Jim's group.
Yep.
Right. And now Jim's group gets the controls and accessibilities. And, some of those activities die hard,
Yep.
right?
We're creatures of habit.
And they're deep in the organization and how we've structured it for years. You just don't scrub it all out overnight.
I mean, as the saying goes, we're truly blessed to live in really interesting times. Um, but it also means that you don't sleep much. you know,
Yeah,
there,
the way I put it is this industry is so exciting because no matter when you get into it, you're getting in at the beginning of something.
yeah, exactly.
But what that also introduces is new challenges, right? New challenges to have the same kind of visibility and awareness that you had with previous systems, right? I mean, I talk about how you remember when virtualization first came
Yeah,
in, and it was like, oh my God, it's like, wow. And it's like, what's this V motion? What do you mean it moved? Right? And you're all of a sudden realizing I don't have visibility into that egg carton and all that's going on inside of it. This is a whole new world, but it gave way for whole new tools. And in many, many ways, we're seeing the exact same thing, magnitudes greater, I would argue, in the cloud,
yeah,
um, because it's the same, only more, right?
exactly. It's kind of funny when you think about it. We were having a sidebar before our discussion today. I cut my teeth on a K Pro 2 running CPM and 5 1/4 drives. That's what I
Yeah,
did my honors thesis on. And you go
man.
from that to like Lambda functions.
Right? Exactly. And that's one of the things. Well, and then when you throw in, like I was talking about with the advent of AI, where before the accessibility that AI gives me,
Hmm.
I wouldn't even know where to begin. I'd have to go to YouTube and say how to write Lambda functions and watch videos and right.
Yeah,
Now, I mean, I showed that, right? I just type out, write a Lambda function to stand up a complete data center with zero trust principle. I mean, and boom, there it went. The thing is, I don't know if it works or not, right?
it,
That's what's different.
that's the
It's
interesting
really
dynamic.
amazing, and it's only getting better and better.
I loved again going back to your presentation how much I enjoyed that, and I have been throwing out this term a little bit. All knowledge is knowable. Right now, with that
Totally.
prompts, and a little bit of thought about the way I structure those
Yep.
prompts, I have access to effectively all the world's knowledge to date. There's
Yep.
still some obscure little enclaves that aren't really fully accessible, but
Yep.
as a general rule of thumb, everything is there. That
We all
also
have an
puts
assistant.
this burden on us. How did you not know that? You didn't do a search. I had a buddy when I worked in the data
That's
center,
so funny.
and occasionally you would ask questions that were really stupid, and he would send you a URL, and I can't remember it, but it let me Google that for you. But it was the first initial of that, so it was
Yeah.
like LG something or other.
Right.
um, and now you have that, oh, let me co-pilot that for you, let me open eye for all those types
Yeah.
of things. Effectively, you can't even ask your own questions.
It's
You have to be able
it,
to ask these before. So
it's like I think I mentioned it when I presented it. What I say is we all now have an assistant that's as smart as the internet,
yeah, I love
but
that line in your talk. That
dumb
was
as a rock without the
exactly.
right prompt. And I think that's that really, I think, if there was something I would uh, encourage every organization to put a little focus on, it
Hmm.
would be teaching and their people about prompts, what they
Hmm.
mean, how they work, what's the best structure, right? Because there's a structure on the way you set up what you're asking for that will enrich and improve what you get back, right? I always say,
Screaming.
it's a guess. So the more
Yeah.
specificity, the less guess. The less specificity, the more guess.
I had a coworker a while back, and it's directly related to prompts, but back a few years, he really emphasized the role of framing a discussion, because a discussion can go any number of different ways.
Yeah.
But he would come in and say, what I'd like to do is I want to frame this discussion on vulnerability management and prioritization. So all of a sudden, people are looking at it through that guise. That
Yeah. There's a box around that stuff now. Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
good prompt engineering is essentially a glorified frame for how we're positing the questions. In a boss of mine years ago, that was the CEO, he goes, ultimately, your career is going to be judged not by the statements that you make, but by the questions that you ask. And so you see some of this, framing the value of good open-ended questions, but how those questions are structured, kind of
Yeah.
the engineering side of it, that is going to be a force multiplier from somebody's ability to take advantage of some of these wonderful tools that are out there. But like you say,
Totally.
you also have to have the context of what's coming back. I'll sit there occasionally and I'll posit some questions, and I'm reading what's coming back. And it could be one of two things. One, either my prompt was pretty piss poor, I didn't do a very good
Yeah.
job
Yeah.
of it, or the way that the tool is distilling and disseminating out that body of knowledge that it's pulling from is piss poor, but
Right.
the
Right.
results were like,
Right.
I couldn't rely on those types of results. I think if we were to do that same exercise several months from now, where the quality of the prompting improves and the
Always.
quality of the knowledge bases improve, obviously the quality of that outcome is going to be substantially different.
For me, I think what I ponder, Matt, is uh, when you combine the fact, and maybe it's not the exact same metrics, but the pace at which Moore's law
Hmm.
accelerated technology, it's not abating.
Yeah.
It's on the same trajectory or similar. When you factor that in and you consider the pace at which we're able to compute more and more data, larger and
Mhm.
larger data sets. We're improving the training. I kind of liken it to, they say there's even space now, even though my fingers are touching, right? There's
Mhm.
always space. But
Yeah.
that's what's starting to happen where, it used to be like this and it's coming like this, but it's getting to the point where the improvements are unbelievable. And we
Mhm.
saw it when you look at that Will Smith eating spaghetti in just a year, and how much that changed, right? And
Yeah.
the lip sync with the translation. And so I just ponder 3 years from now,
Mhm.
because that's, in our industry, that's kind of around the corner, right? 2 years is
That's when
not
your
so
maintenance
much.
agreements expire.
That's right. Exactly, because we know stuff's going to be changing in that timeline. But
Yep.
I just, I get excited. I hope I live for a good couple more decades anyway, because, it's fascinating to see how things are continuing to evolve. But I certainly expect uh, it's going to be more and more and more difficult to know what you're looking at and whether or not someone created it or someone's AI created it.
Yeah. I will tell you this, it's one of the reasons why one of the joys that I still have in this world is reading actual books. I have the honor with Gary Haysep and Bill Bonnet. We wrote a book called the CISO Desk Reference Guide,
Oh,
Volume
cool.
2, and they're in the Security Canon Hall of Fame. They've done very, very well. They're on their third edition. And I was invited with a handful.
Congratulations, man. That sounds awesome.
It was great. It was a lot of work to get them out the door, but it's a great feeling. And now I'm an editor and reviewing other folks' cybersecurity type books. And just to be able to hold a book in your hand, open up the page. I like reading the old fashioned way.
Yeah.
I go in, I have my trusty pen, my Pilot G2 with blue ink, and I underline and I write stuff in the margin.
Yeah.
I think at some point, our ability to remain focused in a highly distracted world is going to be one of the biggest differentiators. Folks that are still doing, like if you were doing a PhD, your review of literature as part of your dissertation, being able to go through and read a number of books and things of that nature is going to be necessary to help kind of, that data coming out of this tool, this engine, it's good, it's not great. And
My
it gives
daughter,
that
uh,
confidence.
I didn't mean to interrupt. My daughter, um, going for her master's, and one of the things one of her professors told her was the the kids today coming into class are
Mhm.
ill prepared for the volume of reading required
Yeah.
because they're not accustomed to it. They're, this sound bites, snip, snip, Instagram feed kind of world. And now it's, hey, I want you to read this 3, 4, 500 page book.
Hmm.
It's a different discipline,
It
and
really is.
it's definitely one that I'm with you. I really appreciate touching the paper
Yeah.
and reading the words on the paper. And I just get, in fact, for me, sometimes I just can't work until I do it first on paper to get
Uh-huh.
kind of my ideas out. But maybe that's evidence of, my age. Yeah,
And,
exactly.
and then I
Uh,
got what's embarrassing is there's all the paper detritus throughout the office of all my notes, and I go through later, and sometimes I type them up, and
yeah,
sometimes I put them in the shredder. But I have to write things down. I
I'm
think
with you,
there's
man.
a cognitive side of it.
I think there
It,
is too.
it's really
I'll tell you a funny story, and this is true confessions for all you people. Yes, I'm old. When I got called by a recruiter, his name was Rory Marston, and this was at the end of January 1998. He says he's got this startup looking for a hotshot sales guy. It's like, okay, yeah, because I mean, I didn't even ask what they did.
uh,
Then he tells me who they are, and he says, yeah, they do DNS, DHCP, and IP address management.
I think I know the firm.
And I mean, Matt, I was like, I couldn't
What?
spell DNS, man. I mean, and so I'm writing it down. Um, the company was Meta Info, first in the world to port bind to Windows.
Uh-huh.
That was their claim to fame. But anyway, um, when I knew I had the interview, it was on Monday at like 10 o'clock. And so over the weekend, I printed every single page from their website.
Uh-huh.
You
So
know,
you can read it.
now how stupid, right? But it was back when literally the website was very static and it was like a bunch of pages. Really, there was no dynamic content at all. But I had to have it, in on paper to read through it before my interview. And in fact, when I interviewed, I told Scott McFarlane about 15 minutes into the interview, I said, "Hey, do you have a presentation?" "What do you mean?" I said, like a PowerPoint that you'd give to a customer on your first call to introduce yourself. So, "Oh, yeah, we have that." I said, "Okay, give me your slide deck, give me your presentation in 15 minutes, and I'll sell you your product." And I ended up getting the job. But it was the funny part was I had to print off every page over the weekend and have it. And that was how I familiarized myself with everything. It was just something I had to do.
Yep. That's how
Kind
we
of,
learn, though, or at least
it,
that's how maybe we've learned.
it's yeah, how
You
we've
know,
learned to learn, right?
yeah,
And it's where our comfort zone is that draws the most focus and best cognitive processing. I mean, for me, it does, right?
yep.
For sure. So,
It's scary because going back to some of the geopolitical thing, just to segue
sure.
into
Yeah.
TikTok. If you're the CCP, TikTok is the most perfect platform. It gets Americans' attention spans to be very limited.
Yeah.
You can put content in there that is designed to draw people apart, kind of like what we've seen
Divisiveness.
in that
Absolutely.
documentary,
Yeah.
The Social Dilemma, Shoshana Zuboff's
Yes.
classic book on these things. Um, how we look at serious problems is going to be challenged over time. If we have a populace that can only think in 5-minute increments,
Yeah.
and that's kind of at the extreme,
Yeah.
that's a little disconcerting. Um,
Totally. Totally. And I
we're
think
all
also,
guilty of it. It's so easy to be distracted. There's a squirrel everywhere you look.
and that, and I think, um, gosh, man, nobody grows. Not. I should rephrase this. Fewer and fewer people have a garden
I
where
do.
they grow vegetables,
Yep.
right?
I was just going to
Few
bring that up.
and it's not, and I'm not saying, oh gosh, how come we're not going back to the earth? But it's more that we don't want to wait, right?
Yeah.
We want it right now, and that's true in no, but I want a new car and I'll buy it on 84 months.
Hmm.
I mean, whatever, so I can get it now. I want it now. And I do think that has also, that's not healthy for us.
Yeah.
Sometimes uh, it's better to let things steep, like a good
Absolutely.
tea, you know?
It's so funny because literally right out over this window is my garden, and I've planted like rattlesnake beans, which is a long bean,
Yeah,
and it's a leap of faith. You put a little seed into the ground, and you hope it has enough sun, enough water, enough
yeah,
nutrients in the soil to see something come up. But once it does, it's very gratifying. And
yeah.
I've got a couple of small tomato plants planted from seed that are there. And to your point about wanting things immediately, I was just thinking before our call, damn it, this is going to be at least another 60 to 90 days before I
Yeah,
get anything out of there,
yeah, yeah,
but it's,
yeah.
it's the joy of the process. It's delayed gratification that we've gotten away from. Everything can't be instant gratification. There are things
I,
that are meant to take time, and we got to enjoy that journey.
I believe there are many things, Matt, in our lives that are very much like farming.
Yeah.
that uh, we have to do all the right things every day, even though we don't see the benefit. It's
Mhm.
something that we have to, you know, it's a good reminder
Yeah.
that you can't plant a seed and go pick the fruit the next day or the next week, right? And
But
it's
if we don't have people planting seeds, we'll never eat. So it's important that we appreciate and value these folks that do this work, because without
right.
them, we're bumming.
Yeah, that's right. It starts to get pretty bleak.
Yeah.
Well, hey,
It-
Matt, man, I really enjoyed talking with you, getting to know you a little bit. I love these kinds of guests interactions because it's just a clean slate and we can kind of go wherever we want to go. And I really appreciate some of your insight. And I'm going to go back and listen. Do you remember what are those four things again? I think those are
So
important.
the four difficult challenges that we face in our profession,
Yep.
and I don't necessarily have a lot of optimism that they're going to get real, that they're going to get meaningfully better in the immediate future. But one is third party supply chain
Supply
vendor risk
chain. Yeah.
management. Credential management is very challenging, and
And
I'll
when
be
does that also include identity and everything
absolutely.
related? Yeah, that's what I
Yeah, so
thought.
think
Okay.
about it as everything from how do we authenticate, think zero trust, what do I
Sure.
allow you to have
Yep.
access to? And how do I authenticate you, all that type of stuff. So
Yep.
it's more, I think the authentication part with things like FIDO2 and elsewhere, we're getting that part better. Once we're in, then the issue is, why does Matt have access to everything?
Right.
He needs access to one thing.
Right.
That
Right. Right. Well, that's the old way, right?
exactly.
You get in and now you're part of that group.
Exactly. And then you've got kind of vulnerability management, patch management,
Yeah.
firmware, all those things.
Yeah.
I see companies that have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities in their operating environment. So
That
knowing
to me
how to price,
seems, I mean, I'm blown away because that I hear so much that, every organization doesn't have a very strict patch
yeah.
protocol. That just seems like that one's an obvious one. But anyway, and
Software.
then the last
And
one.
look at like firmware and things of that nature,
Yeah,
the
some are more
firmware
challenging, right?
of the hardware. Exactly.
Much, and I also understand not every patch can immediately get applied because it disrupts custom applications and everything, and there's got to be
There's a lot of
testing and
legacy technical debt.
yeah, I get that. I get
And
that.
and then the last one, and there's a common thread with all these that I'll sum it up with in just a moment. But the last one would be kind of data management. So classification,
Classification. Yep.
access, all those things. What's interesting about each of those four kind of unique challenges, Grant, is that it's not really clear who is ultimately accountable. If you think about it from a RACI matrix, responsible,
Mm,
accountable, consulted, informed, who owns vendor management in an organization? Is it legal? Is it finance and accounting? Is it the
yep.
CIO? Is it the
Yeah,
CISO?
not too many organizations are mature or designed in a manner to have someone that runs
Yeah.
horizontal in that role,
And
you
same
know.
thing with like data, is it
Yep.
IT? Like if I always tell people as a CISO, I'm not going to define what the, expiry date is on a data element. That should come from general counsel or somebody that is aware of like a contractual obligation. More,
Right.
more appropriately, the CIO, he or she would be the responsible party with their organization to make sure that data is backed up and retained according to some sort of business derived, like user defined parameter. The business should define how long that is. But you got a lot of this stuff going on. You've
Sure.
got
Scarecrow.
planning. And,
Yeah.
and that's one of the reasons why these issues are challenged. They have some technical issues with them that I think are there, but it's that governance. It's when I was back in Gartner, we would call it FMC, fuzzy management crap. It's all
Mm.
that just kind of stuff that it's really difficult to deal with because it's unclear who ultimately owns that issue, who's going
Yep.
to resource it, support it.
Yep.
How do you deal and arbitrate with conflicting priorities and things of that nature? But it's also one of the joys of our profession is that we've got some really nice, meaty problems to try to solve.
Yeah,
And
no
that's
doubt.
I love that. If you're motivated by learning, if you're motivated by seeing the needle move in the right direction, few things are as rewarding as security, and then few things can be as challenging as security at the same
Yeah,
time.
isn't that the truth? And the good
Which,
news is, I think this job doesn't appear to be stopping. It's not going away. The challenge isn't diminishing in any way. It seems to just continue, and it's getting more and more nuanced. It's getting more accelerated. I think, I always tell people after digital transformation, you're on the
Mhm.
hamster wheel. It's now digital modernization because
And you're never getting
you're never getting off. Not necessarily a bad thing. Just be
yeah,
prepared that that's what's going to happen. And I do think there's a lot of promise to fill the gaps using this brilliant assistant now we all have
yep,
if we effectively manage and control and train our people no differently than we had to inform and train them how to use the internet and how to understand malicious links and all the other. We need to
Mhm.
make sure they understand and are informed about LLMs and public LLMs and how to use them responsibly. But I don't believe any of us can block it. It's here for good
It's
in
the genie's out of
spades.
the bottle.
Yeah, right. That's right. Hey,
It
listen.
does go back to the value of gardening. I have a little plaque in my garden. An hour in the garden puts the world's problems in perspective, or something
Hey,
to that effect.
yeah,
So,
I got a quote. I can't remember it exactly. I'll butcher it, but it said just about everything will work if you turn it off for a few minutes, including yourself.
yep, I love that. That is
So,
perfect.
hey,
Grant,
thank
this was
you.
so much fun.
I really appreciate your time. I enjoyed it. I hope I can have you back.
Would love to.
This has been really informative, and thank you very, very much. I really do appreciate it.
And thank you again. And I'm so glad we had a chance to meet in person at that conference.
Yeah, well,
Again,
I'm
your
glad.
presentation left a great impression. So thank
Yeah,
you.
well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. That means a lot. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Matt Stamper, brilliant guest CEO of his own company. I'm sorry, I'm looking for it. Matt, say it out for
Executive,
me.
CEO of Executive Advisors Group, and I help CISOs and companies with their security programs.
Brilliant. And they can find you, Matt Stamper, on LinkedIn and all information about your company there as well. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope it was as good for you as it was for me, man. I had a great time. We covered a lot of ground, but it's what happens when you get a couple of old guys that, they can talk about just about anything in this world. But hey, really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Please tell your friends, share, like, subscribe, and we'll look forward to having you back on the next episode of Talking Cloud. Thanks so very much.
Thank you.